You're listening to Fulfilling Career, Happy Life, the podcast for accomplished professionals who want to identify what's next in their career and make it happen without compromising what matters most. I'm your host, Randi Roberts, an executive and career life coach, and I'm glad you're here. If you want to feel more energized about your work again, this show is for you. So let's get into it. Hi, thanks for joining me today for Fulfilling Career, Happy Life. I am really excited about this episode. As you know, a lot of times I'll bring on guest experts to address themes and consistencies that I'm seeing coming up with my clients. And it's amazing how often it happens. There just seem to be issues that come up with one client and it comes up with another client very quickly. So I'm really excited to welcome Cindy Harvey today. Cindy is a career and leadership coach. There's a lot of crossover in what Cindy and I do. But the reason that I wanted her to come on is her expertise in really helping corporate high performers sell themselves for roles with more visibility, impact, and influence, even if they think their work should speak for itself. And when I saw that Cindy describes her work in those words, it resonated so strongly for me on behalf of my clients, because I think very often we do think that our work will speak for itself. And Cindy will share with us why sometimes that's just not right. And we need to do a little bit more. So Cindy, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Randi. I'm super excited to be here too and have this conversation. So thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I always love talking to other executive and career coaches. It's just, I come out of these conversations with so many ideas.
Same.
So let's dive in. In general, tell us a little bit about the dynamic of us expecting our work to speak for itself. Why do we do that?
Mm-hmm. You know what? It's one of those things where a lot of times we're not even really aware that that's the approach that we're taking until it stops working. And to me, when I think about from my own professional journey as well as my clients as well, when I think about the why behind why we do this, a lot of it, I think, really goes back to our younger days when we were in school and how we got rewarded, what we got rewarded and recognized for. A lot of times it was when we got that A and we brought that A home. And, when we worked all night, I used to do this all the time, pull an all-nighter and, got an A on my paper or whatever the outcome was. But I think a lot of times it stems from, being recognized for being a great student. And we translate very unconsciously, I think, that experience into our professional life, into our careers, and bring that same experience or that same way of showing up into the workplace. And I think the other thing that's important to know as well is that in the first several years of our careers, it actually works, to allow your work to speak for itself and to be that hard worker, put your head down, create results. When I usually say like the first 10 years or so of your career, or up until you get into management where you have direct reports, I think that strategy actually works pretty well. In that, in those early years, you are trying to build up your reputation. You are trying to build up your credibility and produce results. And the way that you do that is by rolling up your sleeves and, getting the job done. And you get rewarded for that, through the next job comes or the pay raise comes or the promotion comes, whatever it may be. So I think that early several years of our professional life, it still works until we get to that point where we need new tools and new approaches for us to get even further.
That's really interesting. I'm not sure I had really thought about that does work for you early on when you're an individual contributor, say, and it's about, delivering something, some work product. That's really interesting. You said something about it sounds like you relate to this dynamic about how you were when you were a student and the A student and, working all night on a paper. Until I got to grad school, I was not that dedicated a student. But I find that a lot of times coaches, we gravitate towards what we know. So it's interesting to hear you relate to that. Did it impact you in your early career as well?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I would say exactly as it described that in my early career, I would say up until I became a manager, where at that point I was responsible for other people's results as well. But up until the point where it was just about me, then continuing to do what I was doing was fine, and it worked really well. I progressed and made great money and all of that stuff. But I got to a point where other people were either passing me by, or you can see other people like self-advocating and having that feeling of, well, I'm not going to be that guy, and, consciously or unconsciously choosing to not be quote unquote that guy, and not seeing the impact that it has on your own reputation, if we want to use that word. So 100%, I could say that it affected me for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think, thinking about the recognition we got at a young age for delivering the good grades, for example, and then couple that with the messages that so many of us got about being humble and not bragging and things like that. And you could see how that would really have an impact. Do you see any trends, generalities about who this tends to impact more than others?
Yeah, I can just speak from my own experience here, Randi, and majority of the clients that I work with are women. And I think that it does have an impact on us as women. Oftentimes, I think the reason that you just described of the definition of the roles that society has placed on us, and that I think we adopt and accept a lot of times as well, of being humble. If you brag or you talk about yourself or your accomplishments, that it's not a good thing. And I do believe that we have learned those ways of being, and we have accepted them and adopted them in a lot of ways. And that's a big, generalization. So I say that, with a very broad brush. Yeah. But I think that there are many, many examples, at least I've seen throughout my career, where we hold ourselves back as a result of that.
Yeah, you have seen, I think you've probably looked for this more, and you've seen it more in all your experience in talent acquisition and things like that. I've noticed a trend. I think more women are impacted by this kind of, I was going to call it humility, but I don't think that's the right term, holding ourselves back. Mm-hmm. But I also have a lot of men clients, and I see it impacting some of them too at different, in different ways. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not solely women. What are some things that people can keep in mind in terms of, giving ourselves permission to advocate for ourselves and sort of shine our own light?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the word permission that you just mentioned is an important one, of giving ourselves permission, that we don't require anybody else's permission or, the okay to be able to do that. I think another important piece there is that you don't have to do it like anybody else. There's no rules around how to self-advocate, or, I just think of it as being proud, be proud of the work that you've done and what you've accomplished. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think not only do I think that you don't have to do it like anybody else, I actually think that you shouldn't do it like anybody else. And that's when you try to follow the blueprint of, something you read on Google or wherever you might have found it, that's when it starts to not feel so good. And it not becomes something that you don't actually want to do. But if your way of, talking about your accomplishments and being proud of it is, writing your name on the presentation that you've created, just put your name on it. That's a really simple way of creating your brand and communicating, I created this in a way that is, so to speak, subtle, but still gets the point across. So there's lots of different ways to do it, and just be comfortable doing it in your own way.
Yeah. That's a great place to start, is to just take credit for the results of your work in that way. It's interesting. I remember early on in my own career, sort of, tripping upon a way for me to give myself permission to do it. And it wasn't planned. I was in an interview and I realized I was feeling uncomfortable and feeling that tug of, wait a minute, I need to answer their questions and tell them about my accomplishments, but it didn't feel comfortable. And then once you start getting in your head and having that conversation with yourself about it, it's hard to break it. And so what I instinctively did was just said, look, I'm not really comfortable blowing my own horn, but that's kind of what I'm here to do today. So I'm going to tell you. And somehow, I don't know, it was almost like narrating it for myself. In that way, I was able to unlock it and get out of my own head about it.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. I think it kind of just takes the energy out of it for yourself personally, and, addresses maybe the elephant that's in the room, because if you're feeling that way, the person that's interviewing you can see it too. And it just breaks the ice and allows you to be a bit more free. So I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in your experience, before you became a coach, I'm sure you used many of your coaching skills when you were doing talent acquisition. Is that how you came upon this area to gravitate towards and seeing the need there?
Yeah, you know what? I've been in HR for my entire career, really, and the talent acquisition space is when I stepped into, over time. And, to get the next job, you have to learn how to talk about yourself and do it in a way that feels really clear and feels confident. So absolutely, it became even more of a priority, as I stepped into talent acquisition, and as I actually, being an interviewer, I couldn't even tell you how many interviews I've done over the course of my career, or even how many resumes, if we're just talking about those, simple tools from a job search perspective, how many resumes I've looked at, thousands, I'm sure at this point. And there's just so many bad ones out there, and people just don't know how to position themselves and position their work relative to the reputation that they want to convey, as well as where they want to go in their career. So yeah, it was definitely during my talent acquisition years that the spotlight on this became really bright. And I think, again, in my own personal career, when I got to a point where I felt like I was plateaued, I also had to, self-explore and find out, so what's happening there for me? And what am I not doing or other people are doing? And just being able to ask myself those questions so that I can figure out, how am I getting in my own way?
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I'm glad you brought up the resume and how people communicate there, because that's really where it starts. I mean, when you're interviewing for a position, people will see your paper before they see you, whether that's a resume or these days it's very often on LinkedIn. I tend to see a lot of them now because artificial intelligence captures the profiles for the jobs, and then they reach out. I see so many that are loaded with jargon and buzzwords and things, and that's not wrong at all, but somehow it doesn't seem to tell as good a story. Do you work with your clients on presenting themselves through their resume and their profile as well?
I do. Yeah, I do. That's one part of it. It's to me, the resume, the interview really is a part two of the process of figuring out your brand. For me, at least in the way that I approach it in my work, is that it starts with you understanding you as a person, as a professional. And then the resume, all those other pieces, the relationships, the networking, whatever tools we need to use to get to that next stage of our career, to me, fall out pretty naturally from that foundation. But it really starts with understanding, first of all, how did you get to the place that you're at today? What choices and decisions have you made along the way to create the situation that you're in, whether you love it or you don't? It didn't happen by accident. What are your strengths? What are your values? Some of those pieces are really the foundation of what would then translate into a resume or translate into a LinkedIn or into a networking conversation or into an interview. But I think without having those upfront pieces, it becomes much more challenging to convey that brand through some of those other tools.
That's an excellent point, because so many people say, they want to be authentic. And I mean, I say that a lot. And I think that's the way that you show up, and you can have a natural conversation and you can support your statements with examples and things like that. But it's hard to be authentic if you haven't done that inner work to figure out who you are and how you want to present that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because sometimes I think, sometimes it's real. You just have to have a job, that we have responsibilities, and that becomes the most important driver. But sometimes I think we could end up positioning ourselves for the wrong job because you almost get caught up in it. And that's something to know up front too. If you know yourself and you're really presenting yourself in that authentic way, you'll get a feel for whether something's right or not the right fit for you.
100%. 100%. I often coach my clients that, sure, the company is assessing you and they're evaluating whether you're the right fit for them, but you also are doing that with the company. And so, learning how to make that assessment and figure out whether something's a good fit for you. I think it all starts with some of those pieces around values and, the strengths. What are you really good at doing? Where do you see yourself? Not this job, but the next job or the next one after that. And I think, to circle it back to letting our work speak for itself, once you have a good understanding, you've got those results really built up and you've got that credibility and that reputation. It's then about positioning the work that you've done relative to where you want to go next. And then it becomes a very natural conversation because you've done that heads down work for the first several years of your career. And now it's about figuring out how to articulate that verbally. I think that's a big piece. I think a lot of us spend a lot of time in our head thinking about it and, playing, I call it mental chess, playing chess in our mind of figuring out, what chess piece to move next. But I think it is about articulation verbally and talking about it. The more you talk about it, the more natural it feels and the easier it is, I think, to position those results in the work that you've done.
Yeah. I have similar conversations with a lot of my clients about we have to get out of our heads and we have to actually say the things and practice that and whatever. What kinds of tips do you discuss with your clients along those regards? Like how do you work with them to really get that message out, to help them get that message out?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the first pieces of advice I would give is to decide that doing this matters, right? What's your why behind wanting to actually, learn how to position yourself and build that brand and figure out how to use your results to help you get to that next level, and making that conscious choice, I think, is the first starting point. And then as far as kind of more practical tips. So one thing that I used to do several years ago in my corporate life was I'd often, because of the role I had, I'd be in meetings throughout the whole day, all day, every day. That was my world.
I remember that world.
Yeah. I'm sure you know it well too. And one of the little tips that I used to use personally was I always have a notebook. I have one beside me right now. And as I'm, listening to the conversation or whatever the discussion is, if something comes up in my mind, instead of, kind of getting lost in my own thought and being disconnected from the conversation, I just jot it down on my piece of paper. That gets it out of my head, allows me to see it. And then my next step then is to actually say it. So I think getting it out of your head, and that's one way of doing it in the moment in a meeting or something like that, where you can jot something down. I think that's one way that I would invite people to think about it. And one other tip I can share, again, just from my own personal career, is especially again, once I got into more senior level positions and I had teams and bigger roles and bigger responsibility, was I would tell myself, like, I get paid to have an opinion in this room. I get paid to come into this conversation, to share my expertise, and to help guide this, this collective of professionals to the right outcome. That's my job. That's my job. And part of being able to do that means I need to express what I think, and people can only respond to what you let them see. So if you're not happy, if I wasn't happy with, the perception or being left out of certain conversations or not being invited or whatever the case may be, a lot of times that was because I didn't let them see that I had a perspective on this topic. I had something to say. And so that was another, just a mindset thing that I had to shift for myself, and seeing it as a responsibility really helped me personally to start making that shift.
It's such a great point, because this is not just about interviewing for a job. This is about advocating for yourself overall once you're there, to use your voice and to be willing to take a risk. If you're going to offer an opinion, you're not always right. And so I'm so glad you brought that up, because we're doing this. We're advocating for ourselves all the time. I know when I was, a leader I was in pharmaceuticals. I used to talk, think out loud. I'm just going to think out loud here in a group of people with my team or whatever, and sort of process it and allow them to follow my train of thought. And sometimes I would, it might be a minute I was processing something, and a lot of times it would lead us somewhere. And occasionally I would just say, well, okay, that one didn't go anywhere. That's fine. Let's move on.
Right.
And in that way, make it okay for other people to take a bit of a risk, and a thought that someone starts, someone else can pick up, that kind of thing. So.
100%. Yeah. I love that idea of being the example. Right. And again, it starts with deciding that that's the way that you want to show up, and that's the brand that you want to have, and to allow yourself to be a bit imperfect and be okay with that. I think a lot of times we believe that there's judgment from the people around us, but a lot of times it's us judging ourselves. So if we're able to just drop that and just be present in the moment and have the conversation, then all kinds of wonderful things can happen from there.
Yeah, it's a great point. We tend sometimes to be kinder to and about others than the things that we sometimes tell ourselves and hold ourselves back about, we would never say to someone else.
Exactly.
Which is interesting. Sometimes, when I'm talking to clients about the messages they want to get out and that kind of thing, one of the tricks that we'll use is I'll tell them, pretend you're talking about someone else that, that you really like, that you really respect, that you really support. Say it like you're talking about somebody else. And in a way, I don't want to say it makes me sad, because that's overstating it. It feels unfortunate that we have to play that game with ourselves, but sometimes just flexing the muscle in that way can get us used to, making those statements. And again, being the example, for those of us who have, achieved a certain amount in the company. Most of my clients are leaders. They have leaders and they are leaders. And so being that example, even in, being proud of your own accomplishments and things like that, I think is important.
Mm-hmm.
What other tips are top of mind for you that might be helpful to our listeners in terms of them getting comfortable developing a practice even of advocating for themselves or doing that going forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other one that comes to mind, Randi, is that is understanding that this can feel really hard. It can feel really hard to put yourself out there, and to build on the point that you just shared about advocating on behalf of someone else. Like, that's something we all can do. I can sell you, like hot bread, Randi. But when it comes to selling myself, it feels like there's more at risk. It feels way more personal. It feels like I'm exposed, and it feels vulnerable. And I think that's part of why it feels so hard to do it on our own behalf. So I think just giving ourselves a bit of grace around that too is really important. And I think a lot of it, there's some skill to it and there's art to it, but I think a lot of it really is in between our own ears and what we're telling ourselves about doing it and what it means about us if it doesn't go well, or they don't respond the way that we thought that they would, or they didn't latch on to our idea and run with it. We create these stories about what that means, and it's not real. It's not real. It doesn't allow us to grow either. It allows us to stay still, which is not what my client base typically wants, and I'm sure yours as well. So I would say that, recognizing that it's hard, and the why behind it being difficult, and just give yourself a little bit of slack.
I like that thought, giving yourself a little bit of slack, a little bit of grace, because I think sometimes we want something to be perfect before we let it escape our lips. And that does a couple of things. First of all, that gets you in your head rehearsing it before you let it out. Mm-hmm. It holds you back. Sometimes the moment has passed, and whatever you're saying to yourself in your head is, isn't relevant so much anymore. So, and I think, as so many things, my corporate career, now having my own business, it's remarkable to me how often something comes up where I have to remind myself, it doesn't have to be perfect, just get it going. And so I think the sentiment you expressed about giving ourselves grace is such good guidance, something we can keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One day at a time, Randi. That's it. We don't have to have it all right today.
One day at a time to remind ourselves every day, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, no, so wise. I really appreciate that. Is there anything else that you want to mention that we haven't discussed, Cindy, along the lines of helping people be aware, be more comfortable advocating for themselves?
Yeah, I think the only wrap-up point that I would share, Randi, is to do it. Is to do it, and to recognize that it is our individual responsibility to create the version of our career or version of our life, whichever one that we desire to have. And and I think that's really a gift and a privilege to have that opportunity to be able to create something that you envision in your own imagination, and to take some steps forward to bring it to life. And so why not? What's the downside of not doing it? What are you risking by not giving it a try? Think about that as well. And I would just say, try and see where it goes. You never know. You could be very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. I love what you just said, because if it feels like there's a risk in stepping forward, we need to remind ourselves there's a risk in staying back. So just take it. I like that a lot. Thank you. Mm-hmm. It's been such a great conversation, Cindy. Tell us how the listeners can find you, if they want to know more about you or potentially work with you.
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity, Randi. So there's two ways. One is to connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search for my name, Cindy Harvey, and you'll find my smiling face. So feel free to send a request to connect with me. The other option as well is that I send a weekly newsletter to my subscribers, really all about learning how to create your professional brand, how to sell yourself, leadership, get ahead in your career. And so anybody's welcome to join that as well if they'd like something to land in their inbox. And you go to cindyharveyonline.com/join to do that.
Okay. I'll make sure that those links are available in the show notes so that folks can find you. So thank you again so much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation, and I'd like to keep in touch because you've helped me think of things in a little bit different way that I think can be of benefit to my clients. So I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Randi. This was fun. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to Fulfilling Career, Happy Life. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, follow, rate, and review. Do all the things to show your support for this podcast. It helps other professionals who want to feel more energized about their work again find us. And if you want to take this thinking further, please follow me on LinkedIn, where I share content on a regular basis. You can also get on my email list by downloading the Career Satisfaction Assessment or through my website. All these links are in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in. I truly appreciate that you make the time for yourself to listen to the show. See you next week.